The heat in the pouring bay of Titan Aerospace Casting is a physical barrier that hits you the moment you step through the double-pane tempered glass doors. At 55 years old, after 27 years of standing on these concrete floors, my joints can tell you the ambient temperature within 2 degrees. The air here always smells of burnt sand, sulfur, and the sweet, heavy scent of cooling oil that hangs like a fog over the casting pits. I work in the engineering mezzanine office, overlooking the main foundry floor, where the 5-ton induction furnaces tilt to pour liquid metal, vibrating the glass and making the drawings on my desk tremble in rhythm. I started here in 1999 as a junior metallurgical technician fresh out of college, back when this place was a 3-furnace operation run by Roger Campbell. Roger was a man who wore steel-toed boots to board meetings, drank black coffee from a stained thermos, and could identify a casting defect simply by the sound the cooled metal made when struck with a brass hammer. We built this facility together, transition by transition, from a regional automotive supplier into a heavy aerospace defense supplier. Today, Titan Aerospace Casting is the sole supplier of low-pressure turbine blades for the military's latest generation of turbofan engines, the F-135 propulsion system. Our primary aerospace contract with the Defense Department is worth $85 million annually, representing the vast majority of our total $120 million in annual revenue. The secret to our success lies in the proprietary heat treatment process we use for titanium aluminide castings. Titanium casting is a temperamental process. Liquid titanium is highly reactive with oxygen. If it touches air at high temperatures, it burns with a blinding white flame, destroying the mold and creating a porous, brittle mess. The entire process must occur under a deep vacuum or a pure argon atmosphere. But the real challenge is not the melting, it is the cooling. In 2012, after 3 years of analyzing thousands of microstructures, I patented the Crest thermal graded system. It is a method of using localized induction heating coils inside the vacuum chamber to precisely control the cooling rate of different sections of a jet turbine blade. If the thin, trailing edge of a blade cools faster than the thick root, the internal stresses will tear the grain structure apart, making it useless. My system uses a complex algorithm that adjusts the induction coil power second by second based on real-time infrared sensor feeds. It is registered under United States Patent number 8,456,123. Roger Campbell knew the value of what I had created, but the company could not afford to buy the patent outright back then. So we signed a licensing agreement drafted by my attorney, George Lawson. Titan Aerospace Casting got an exclusive, non-transferable license to use patent number 8,456,123 for a licensing fee of $1 a year. The catch was Clause 14C, a golden handcuff clause. The license remained active only as long as I, Nicholas Thorne, was employed by Titan as the active lead process engineer. If the company terminated my employment for any reason, other than voluntary retirement or gross misconduct, the license would automatically revoke at 12:01 in the morning the following day. Roger signed it without hesitation, telling me that as long as he ran the place, I was the backbone of the company. But Roger did not run the place anymore. 6 months ago, Roger's health began to fail, and he stepped back to become chairman of the board, leaving daily operations to his 38-year-old son, Charles Campbell. Charles arrived at the plant with a business degree from an elite university, tailored designer suits, and an absolute disdain for the people who actually did the work. To Charles, the foundry floor was not a place where high-grade aerospace components were forged. It was just a spreadsheet with too many expenses. He immediately hired a group of young consultants who spent 3 weeks walking around with clipboards. They concluded that the engineering department was bloated and that we were paying legacy salaries that were out of line with modern market rates. My salary, earned through nearly 3 decades of late nights and emergency troubleshooting, was a red flag on Charles's balance sheet. Charles wanted to install his nephew Nathan Campbell, a 26-year-old who had never seen a casting furnace. Charles assumed that because the machinery was automated, anyone with a degree could run it. He did not understand that the automation ran on a delicate software stack, requiring constant tweaking based on ingot purity and cooling loops. Over the last month, Charles micromanaged my hours and refused to approve new infrared sensors, claiming the old ones could last another 6 months. I warned him that degraded sensors on a vacuum furnace casting military turbine blades was a recipe for failure. He replied that he ran the numbers, and I just ran the furnaces. I knew then that my days at Titan were numbered, but I didn't expect him to be stupid enough to move as fast as he did. The Monday morning of my termination, a 3-car pileup on the Interstate 75 bridge ground my commute to a standstill. Ordinarily, I arrived at 7:30 in the morning to walk the floor and review vacuum telemetry logs. Today, despite leaving early, I didn't pull in until 7:58. By the time I stood before the biometric clock, the readout flickered to 8:02 in the morning. I scanned my thumb, the machine registering my entrance. Charles Campbell blocked my path to the locker room, his arms crossed. Behind him stood Nathan, looking uncomfortable in unscuffed boots, with several morning shift workers watching in silence. Charles announced loudly that I was late. I explained the bridge accident had backed up traffic for 4 miles and that I had messaged the supervisor. Charles snapped that he did not care, claiming that if leadership could not respect the schedule, the hourly workers wouldn't either. He noted this was my 3rd time clocking in after 8 in the morning this month. I told him I stayed late to keep his furnaces from freezing and that the hours were documented. Charles replied that the hours that mattered were the ones on the clock. He pulled a manila folder from under his arm and held it out to me, stating that they were implementing a new culture of accountability at Titan. He claimed my legacy attitude and constant insubordination had become a liability, and that, effective immediately, I was terminated for cause due to attendance violations. The hallway went completely silent. I asked him if he was really firing me for cause after 27 years over a 2-minute delay on a blocked highway. Charles smirked, telling me that my 27 years did not buy me a pass to ignore the rules. He warned me not to ask for a severance package, claiming the employee handbook was clear about chronic tardiness and that I had breached my contract. He was trying to save the company a $180,000 severance payout, which was what my contract guaranteed if I was terminated without cause. He thought he was being brilliant, clearing a high salary off the books while avoiding the exit penalty. Charles continued, stating that Nathan would be taking over the lead process engineer role, claiming the boy had a modern education and understood data-driven manufacturing. He demanded I hand over my badge, my company laptop, and my office keys. Nathan wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared at his pristine boots, his face flushed. I didn't yell or argue. I didn't tell Charles that without my daily adjustments, the quality controls on the titanium runs would fall apart within 48 hours. I told him I understood. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my security badge, and unclipped it from my belt. I placed it on top of the manila folder in Charles's hand, followed by my office keys. I told him I would need to pack my personal belongings from my desk. Charles instructed Nathan to accompany me to ensure I only took what belonged to me, giving me 10 minutes before security would escort me to the gate. I walked up the stairs to the engineering mezzanine, Nathan trailing 2 steps behind me like a nervous shadow. The office was quiet. I grabbed a cardboard shipping box from the supply closet and began packing my things. A framed photo of my late wife, my favorite ceramic mug, and a stack of old notebook journals filled with handwritten calculations of alloy cooling rates and heat treatment cycles dating back to 1999. Nathan watched me pack the journals. He asked if those were company property. I held one up and told him they were my personal engineering journals containing notes I took during my own time. Explaining that the formulas and equations were public metallurgical knowledge, I added that the proprietary code and parameters were all in the SCADA control software on the main server, which he could access directly. Nathan replied that he had full administrator access, trying to sound confident. I told him that was good, noting that the basic login credentials for the furnace interface were written on the yellow notepad under the keyboard. I advised him to monitor the oxygen levels in vacuum furnace 3 during the pour, as it tended to leak through the shaft seal when the pressure dropped below 10 to the -4. Nathan crossed his arms and muttered that he knew how to run a furnace. I told him I was sure he did. I picked up my box, looked around the office one last time, and walked down the stairs. Charles was waiting at the exit door, standing next to a burly security guard. As I approached, I stopped and wished him good luck with the turbine runs this week, reminding him that the Defense Department audit was on Thursday. Charles sneered, claiming they did not need luck because they had systems now, and told me to enjoy my retirement. I nodded, walked out the glass doors, and stepped into the morning air. I walked to my truck, placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel. For the first time in 6 months, I felt completely calm. I pulled out my phone and dialed George Lawson's direct line. I told him the kid had just done it, firing me for cause over a 2-minute delay because of the bridge traffic. On the other end of the line, I heard George chuckle. He said Charles was a bigger idiot than we thought, and asked if I had signed anything. I told him I only signed the termination receipt acknowledging that I received the letter, with no release of claims or severance agreement. George said that was perfect, his tone turning sharp and professional. He told me he would draft the formal notice according to Clause 14C of the 2012 licensing agreement, stating that their right to use patent number 8,456,123 would terminate at exactly 12:01 in the morning tonight. He added that he would have the cease and desist letter delivered to their corporate offices and their legal counsel by 9 in the morning tomorrow. I told him to make sure he copied the Department of Defense procurement officer on the letter, noting that they needed to know that every turbine blade Titan casts starting tomorrow is an active patent infringement. George agreed, telling me to go get some breakfast because the next few days were going to be very busy. The legal gears turned with silent, devastating precision. At 12:01 in the morning on Tuesday, the exclusive licensing agreement for United States patent number 8,456,123 expired. By 9 in the morning, George's courier had delivered 3 copies of a formal cease and desist notice. The first went to Charles Campbell's office at Titan Aerospace Casting. The second was hand-delivered to Titan's external corporate counsel, Bruce Higgins. The third copy was emailed directly to Colonel Lawrence Sinclair, the Chief Procurement Officer for the Department of Defense's Aerospace Division. On Tuesday morning, I enjoyed coffee on my back porch. At 9:15, George called to confirm delivery. He said Titan's attorney, Bruce Higgins, had called in a panic, wanting to know if this was a joke. George had emailed him the signed agreement and patent receipt, making it clear that as of 12:01 in the morning, Titan had no right to use the Crest system. He warned Higgins that if they heated up a single furnace using my cooling curves, we would file for an emergency federal injunction. George explained to Higgins that under federal patent law, Title 35 of the United States Code, Section 284, willful infringement carries treble damages, which means triple the actual financial loss. Since their military contract is worth $85 million, a willful infringement ruling could easily bankrupt the company. Higgins said he was going to call Charles immediately, noting that Higgins is smart enough to know that Charles is for cause. Firing over a 2-minute traffic delay would never hold up in court. Charles had essentially triggered the license termination himself by trying to dodge a severance payout. While George was dealing with the lawyers, a different crisis was unfolding on the foundry floor. I knew the operational rhythm of the plant better than anyone. Tuesday was our heavy casting day. The schedule called for 20 low-pressure turbine blades to be cast for the military's F-135 engine program. These blades are made from a specialized gamma titanium aluminide alloy, which requires incredibly precise thermal management to prevent microscopic cracking. At 10:30 in the morning, I received a text message from Dennis, the senior lead furnace operator who had worked under me for 15 years. Dennis was one of the few who knew the technical reality of what kept the plant running. He texted me that Nathan was in over his head, explaining that he loaded the new batch of titanium ingots, but the software was throwing a calibration error on the infrared sensors. The batch chemistry was slightly different from last week, with a higher iron trace, and the system needed the sensor coefficients recalculated to adjust the parameter readings. Dennis added that Nathan did not know how to do the math and was trying to bypass the safety interlocks. I stared at the screen of my phone. The control software was programmed to halt the cycle if the sensor coefficients did not match the alloy batch chemistry. To bypass it, Nathan would have to enter the developer override mode and run the furnace in manual calibration. If he did that, the furnace would not adjust the cooling coils dynamically. It would apply a flat cooling rate, assuming the thermal conductivity of the alloy was uniform. But titanium aluminide does not cool uniformly. The thin trailing edge of the turbine blade, which is only a few millimeters thick, cools 4 times faster than the solid root of the blade. I texted Dennis back, instructing him not to touch the controls and to let Nathan do whatever he wanted. I told him to document everything Nathan did on the shift log and to make sure he got a copy of the software bypass. Approval signed by Charles. Dennis replied that Charles was right there on the floor, screaming at Nathan to get the run started, claiming he was not letting some lazy engineer's fake patent stop his production. Dennis added that they had just initiated the vacuum pump down on Furnace 3. I knew exactly what was happening inside Furnace 3. The pumps would pull the chamber down to 10 to the -4, and the induction coils would melt the titanium at 1600 degrees Celsius. Without the Crest algorithm dynamically adjusting the coils during cooling, thermodynamics would take over. As the molten metal filled the ceramic mold, the thin sections would solidify almost instantly, contracting and pulling away from the thicker root. This thermal stress would create microscopic tears and internal fissures. Externally, the blades would look perfect, but they would fail any ultrasonic or X-ray inspection. At 1 in the afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Charles. The arrogant sneer was gone from his voice, replaced by a strained, forced cordiality. He told me they had received some paperwork from my attorney and thought there had been a massive misunderstanding. He asked me to come into the office this afternoon so they could resolve the transition smoothly. I told him there was no misunderstanding, reminding him that I was fired for cause for being 2 minutes late and that my badge and keys were taken. Charles pleaded with me to be reasonable, claiming the patent license was a separate matter. He argued that they had been using that process for 12 years and that I could not just shut down a national defense production line, claiming it was federal property. I corrected him, stating that the factory was his property, but the patent was my property. I told him he chose to terminate the contract that gave him the right to use it, and warned him that if they were running the titanium castings today, they were doing so in violation of federal patent law. I suggested he consult with Bruce Higgins, who could explain the concept of treble damages. Charles shouted that they were running the batch right now, and that I could not stop them because they had the software and the machinery. I told him I hoped Nathan calculated the thermal expansion coefficients for that high iron batch correctly, warning him that if not, they were melting $80,000 worth of raw titanium just to make expensive scrap metal. Before he could respond, I hung up the phone. By Wednesday morning, the consequences of Charles's arrogance had materialized in the quality control laboratory. The plant's non-destructive testing technician, Brian, ran the 20 turbine blades, cast during Nathan's bypass run through the ultrasonic scanner, and the high-energy X-ray imaging booth. Every single one of the 20 blades failed. The scan report showed a network of microscopic internal fractures running along the boundary lines where the thin trailing edges met the thick core of the blade. It was a classic case of thermal stress cracking. In aerospace manufacturing, these parts are subject to centrifugal forces and temperatures that would cause even a minor defect to fail catastrophically in mid-flight, destroying a jet engine and potentially crashing an aircraft. The entire batch, $80,000 in raw titanium aluminide alloy and another $20,000 in specialized ceramic molds and argon gas, was complete scrap. While Nathan was staring at the failed scan reports in panic, the corporate office was hit by a second wave. Colonel Lawrence Sinclair of the Department of Defense Procurement Office had acted immediately upon receiving George's letter. He issued a formal quality defect and legal dispute hold, suspending Titan's authorization to ship any aerospace components to the military. The letter stated that Titan's shipping privileges were suspended pending a comprehensive audit of their manufacturing processes and verification of their intellectual property rights. Without the authorization to ship, Titan could not submit invoices. Without invoices, the company's $85 million cash flow came to an abrupt, violent halt. By noon on Wednesday, the situation reached the ears of Roger Campbell, the 68-year-old founder. Recovering from a heart procedure at his home, Roger called Charles. According to the administrative assistant who was outside Charles's office, Roger's voice was loud enough to be heard through the heavy wooden door. He told Charles that he had spent 40 years building a reputation for engineering excellence, and his son had managed to destroy it in 48 hours just to save a $180,000 severance payout. Roger ordered Charles to do whatever it took to get me back, threatening that if the defense contract was canceled, he would personally call an emergency board meeting to strip Charles of his executive authority and liquidate his shares. Charles tried calling my phone repeatedly between 1 in the afternoon and 2 in the afternoon. I left the phone on silent on my kitchen counter. When he couldn't reach me, he sent his corporate attorney, Bruce Higgins, along with Nathan, to my house. They pulled up in Higgins's luxury sedan. I was in the front yard pruning my rose bushes. Higgins got out of the car, adjusting his tie, looking uncomfortable in the midday heat. Nathan stood behind him, looking like a teenager who had been caught shoplifting. Higgins walked up the driveway and told me they needed to talk, explaining that they had a crisis at the plant and needed to resolve the patent issue immediately. He claimed Charles was willing to offer me a consulting fee to help Nathan get the furnaces calibrated. I didn't stop clipping the roses. I told Higgins I had nothing to say to him, and certainly nothing to say to Nathan. I added that if Titan wanted to talk, my attorney's office was open, and that I would only negotiate in George Lawson's office and only with Charles present. Higgins urged me to be reasonable, reminding me that the military contract was on the line and that if they defaulted, nearly 200 workers on the foundry floor could be laid off. I looked up and told him that Charles should have thought about those 200 workers before he fired his lead engineer over a 2-minute traffic delay to place his nephew in a position for which he had no qualifications. I added that the meeting would be at George's office at 4 in the afternoon today, and that if Charles was not there, we would file the patent infringement lawsuit in federal court first thing tomorrow morning. At 4 in the afternoon, I walked into George's conference room. Charles was already sitting at the table. His hair was messy, his collar was open, and the arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn on Monday morning had been completely erased. He looked like a man who had not slept in 36 hours. Bruce Higgins sat next to him, a stack of legal documents spread out before him. Charles told me I had made my point and blocked their shipments, but claimed I could not hold the company hostage because they had been using the process for 12 years. He threatened to sue me for tortious interference and sabotage if I did not release the patent block. George didn't even blink. He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table containing copies of the SCADA system logs from Tuesday which Dennis had exported and sent to us. George explained that the logs showed Nathan entered a developer bypass code to override the thermal calibration safety interlocks, and that it also showed Charles's electronic signature approving the bypass. George told Charles that they had intentionally run the furnaces in violation of the manufacturer's safety protocols and produced 20 defective turbine blades. He noted that this was not sabotage by me, but gross operational negligence by Charles and Nathan. George warned them that if we showed this to Colonel Sinclair during the audit tomorrow, Titan would not just be suspended. They would be permanently debarred from receiving government contracts. Charles stared at the logs, his mouth opening slightly. He looked at Higgins, but Higgins just shook his head, staring down at his notepad. Higgins knew they had no cards left to play. Charles whispered, asking what I wanted, his hands trembling slightly. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and told him my terms were non-negotiable. I warned him that if he did not agree to every single one of them by 5 in the afternoon, George would send the federal lawsuit and the SCADA logs to the Department of Defense. I nodded to George, who opened a second folder and read the terms aloud. First, George said, Nicholas Thorne will be reinstated as an independent chief metallurgical consultant under a 3-year contract. The consulting fee will be $300,000 per year, paid in monthly installments guaranteed regardless of the company's financial status. Charles winced but said nothing. Second, George continued, a signing bonus of $200,000 will be paid immediately to cover consulting setup fees and damages for wrongful termination. Third, a new patent licensing agreement for patent number 8,456,123 will be executed. The annual licensing fee is now $50,000, plus a royalty of 2% on the gross invoice value of every casting produced using the Crest thermal gradient system. Charles gasped, pointing out that 2% was over $1,700,000 a year on the aerospace contract alone. I told him that was the cost of doing business, noting that he wanted a data-driven system and that this was the data. Fourth, George said, the immediate termination of Charles Campbell as Chief Operating Officer and Nathan Campbell as Lead T Process Engineer. They are to have no involvement in the operations of Titan Aerospace Casting going forward. Roger Campbell must either resume the Chief Executive Officer role or appoint a professional independent executive approved by the board. Charles yelled, asking if I was firing him from his own father's company. George replied coolly that Roger Campbell agreed with this term, explaining that he had spoken with Roger an hour ago, and that Roger had already signed the board resolution authorizing these terms, knowing it was the only way to save the company from bankruptcy. Charles slumped back in his chair, defeated. On Thursday morning, I walked back through the front doors of Titan Aerospace Casting. I was not wearing a uniform, and I did not scan my thumb at the biometric time clock. Instead, I wore a comfortable canvas jacket, and the receptionist handed me a new laminated security pass that read, Chief Metallurgical Consultant. Charles Campbell's office was locked, and a professional mover was inside packing his personal items into cardboard boxes. Both Charles and Nathan had been escorted from the property by security. At 5 in the afternoon the previous evening, the board of directors had acted swiftly, appointing Alan Cole, a veteran manufacturing executive with 30 years of foundry experience, as the interim chief executive officer. Alan was a man who understood that a factory is only as good as the engineers who keep the machines running, welcoming me with a firm handshake and a fresh cup of coffee. On the foundry floor, the tension of the last 6 months had evaporated. Dennis and the operators waved as I climbed to the mezzanine. Dennis smiled, welcoming me back. We spent the next 4 hours rectifying Nathan's damage. The 20 ruined titanium blades were loaded into scrap bins to be sold back to the supplier for recycling at a fraction of their cost. Fortunately, Nathan hadn't melted the induction coils, but the pump shaft seal on Furnace 3 had degraded from the excess heat. I supervised the maintenance crew as they replaced the seal and recalibrated the sensors. Next, I opened the SCADA calibration module and recalculated the sensor coefficients based on the new ingot batch's iron trace levels, entering the correct values to restore the algorithm's dynamic feedback loops. At 1:30 in the afternoon, we loaded a fresh batch, pumped the chamber down, and initiated the pour. This time, the sensors registered the temperatures and the system responded instantly, adjusting the coils to keep the trailing edges at the exact temperature required. By 3, the cooling was complete. We took the blades straight to Brian in the laboratory. Dennis and I watched the ultrasonic scans. One by one, they appeared on the screen, displaying a uniform, defect-free pattern. Brian confirmed 0 defects, declaring them ready for shipment. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Colonel Lawrence Sinclair and his team of military quality inspectors arrived at the plant for the emergency audit. Alan Cole and I met them in the main conference room. I presented the calibration logs, the ultrasonic scan results, and the newly signed patent licensing agreement, proving that Titan had the legal right to use the casting process and that the quality controls were fully restored. Colonel Sinclair reviewed the data in silence, then looked at me and Alan Cole. He noted that it seemed the company had a temporary lapse in operational oversight. Alan Cole replied smoothly that they had restructured their management team, giving me full authority over the metallurgical processes and reinstituting their strict quality protocols. Colonel Sinclair nodded, satisfied, stating he was glad to hear it because the military needed the turbine blades, and promised to sign the authorization to lift the shipping hold immediately, clearing them to resume deliveries by Friday morning. The $200,000 signing bonus check had cleared into my bank account. The new patent licensing agreement was officially active, meaning Titan would pay me $50,000 annually, plus a 2% royalty on every aerospace turbine blade they cast. Based on their current production schedule for the defense contract, those royalties would yield over $140,000 every month. I sat on my back porch on Friday afternoon, watching the wind rustle through the trees. My phone sat beside me, quiet. I didn't have to think about checking the night shift logs. I didn't have to worry about arriving at a biometric clock by 8 in the morning, and I didn't have to listen to a business graduate tell me how to do a job I had spent half my life mastering. Charles Campbell had tried to save a relatively small severance payout and assert his authority by firing an experienced engineer. In doing so, he had destroyed his own executive career, lost his father's trust, and forced his family's company to pay me millions of dollars in royalties for the next 10 years. They had tried to replace me with automated systems and nepotism, only to find out that the systems were worthless without the intellect that created them. I took a slow sip of my coffee, enjoying the silence. The furnaces at Titan were roaring, and the titanium was cooling perfectly.